Hi, welcome to Transmissions from the Transgender Battleground. I'm CatLady762. If you like this video, please consider hitting the little buttons to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Fair warning, this video is going to be long and possibly a little rambly because I have a lot to say. And I figured it's better to do it this way than to do a lot of short videos that may overlap. So today, I want to talk in defense of trans men, specifically men like Buck Angel, who recently made statements about some of the things that are going on in the trans community. Now, most of the statements did center around the concept of autogynephilia, or AGP. And I don't want to address exactly what was said, because I know their statement is being revised at this point. But I've seen enough of the backlash that they have gotten. I've seen a bit of backlash that I have gotten and other trans people. And so I want to talk about this. So whether you really want to consider this a response to what other people have said or not is up to you. And it's not going to be specifically all about AGP. So first off, and I thought I made this relatively clear in my video about HSTS, AGP, and ROGD. I don't believe that HSTS and AGP and ROGD are the only explanations for dysphoria. I don't believe that that was what was said in the statement that was released either. In fact, I'm pretty sure it was said that there are other forms of dysphoria. Now, part of what I see with the issue of AGP in particular is that there does seem to be another narrative that is coinciding with it, in addition to just being a form of dysphoria. And that's that it's the bad form of dysphoria. Now, there are certainly people that have been classified as AGP that are responsible for some bad behavior. There are also people that are classified as HSTS that are responsible for some bad behavior. Part of the issue that I see, and I will admit that I have been guilty at times of perpetuating it, is if you're constantly telling people that their form of dysphoria is bad, well, no one wants to be bad. And I think to some extent, the HSTS form of dysphoria is easier to understand. It's a little bit more sympathetic. It also doesn't hurt matters much that the people that are HSTS are not attracted to women. So sometimes that gets a bit of a free pass in that, well, if they aren't attracted to women, then there's not a concern of sexual violence or sexual motivations against women to transition. Does that necessarily mean that people that are HSTS should be any more allowed in female spaces? No, not really. Unless you think that by being a gay man, you should be allowed in women's spaces. There were a few shows in the 90s that seemed to make that kind of leap. My So-Called Life had a character that was openly gay that frequently hung out in the girls' bathroom, and everyone said, yeah, whatever. It doesn't necessarily mean that that was appropriate. So if you are constantly telling people that the form of dysphoria that they are experiencing is bad or wrong, of course they're going to want to deny it. Now, I myself have been accused of being autogynephile because I waited until I was 39 to transition. That, however, is just a part of my history of dysphoria and my personal history. And I will get into some of that in this discussion probably. But I didn't see the people like Buck saying having autogynephilia is wrong. In fact, I believe their statement asked for people with autogynephilia to get on board with the statements that they were trying to make. The bulk of what I saw was a cry for making dysphoria a key component of being trans again. That over the last several years, dysphoria has been taken out of the idea of being trans. You don't have to have dysphoria to be trans anymore. You just have a gender identity. So if you just have a gender identity and it is just something that you were innately born with, there's nothing you can do about it. Now, I can admit, the thought of that can be somewhat comforting. If I just have something that I was born with that I can't do anything about, then I don't really have any responsibility about the fact that I am trans. Any consequences from choosing to transition were just a result of this innate identity. Takes a lot of burden off, doesn't it? What I saw discussed was that we have dysphoria. And there are many different types of dysphoria, and AGP happens to be one of them. And whether your dysphoria comes from HSTS or AGP or ROGD or any of the other myriad of types of dysphoria, whether you choose to transition or not, understanding where your dysphoria is coming from is going to be helpful. Understanding where your dysphoria is coming from may help you understand whether or not you actually will be helped by transition. Because one of the things that a lot of people don't talk about is that transition increases dysphoria for a lot of people. And not just people that ultimately then decide to detransition. Because there's a difference between having dysphoria because you want to transition and then getting dysphoric because now that you have transitioned, you don't feel like you are getting the results that you want. And the reality is that there are some things that are out of your control. Now, I am not going to call anyone any type of dysphoric, but I do look at forums and Reddit and Twitter when I could, and I see enough comments that make me go, I've known enough people that have decided that they are trans, and I've heard their stories, to at least go, to a few of them. Now, I am not going to say that I don't think they are trans, but I will say, in my very unprofessional opinion, that some of what I have read has made me question whether or not they will ultimately be happy with their decision to be trans. Because in my definition of what being trans is, it means to transition as a result of dysphoria. Because there's lots of people that have dysphoria that don't transition. There are lots of people with dysphoria that are not trans. And we now say that there are lots of people that are trans that don't have dysphoria. If you are transitioning because you are a homosexually attracted person and you are uncomfortable with that, or you are not really sure about it, then transitioning to not be homosexual can be an attractive idea. Somehow, now I had dysphoria from a very early age. Probably from about kindergarten on. But I also know that throughout most of elementary school and middle school, and even a fair bit of high school, I also got messages from my parents and other children that some of my behavior was not appropriate for someone of my sex. See, children are really very big creatures of gender norms. It's one of the reasons why children will usually clock a trans person pretty quickly. Now, partially because children don't have a adult's concept of sex. So children base their ideas of boys and girls and men and women not so much on body parts, but by characteristics. Girls wear dresses. Girls have long hair. Boys like trucks. Boys get dirty. Boys are loud. Girls are quiet. That type of thing. And so if you are a boy who is quiet, or a boy who likes dolls, or a girl that likes football, you may get messages that that's not something that you're supposed to like. Throughout my growing up, I got several of those messages. Some of those messages extended to actual characteristics about myself. The way I talked, the way I stood, the way I carried my books. None of these were things that I was consciously doing. It was not like I was really attempting to pass as a girl. It was just my way of behaving. And I was occasionally called the F word, despite the fact that at that age, I had no idea about sexuality or the act of sex. I did eventually realize that I was attracted to men. But I also really did not have a concept that gay men existed. Somehow, believe it or not, I learned about transsexuals before I learned about homosexual men and women. I know because I remember distinctly not understanding the way that a certain sexual act could be occurring, because the concept of it taking two men did not occur to me. I also know that even when I found out that gay men existed, that, at least in part, why I didn't feel like that applied to me is because the image that I was given of gay men through media did not reflect the men that I was attracted to. So if I wasn't attracted to gay men, I must not be a gay man. Now, I was diagnosed with what was called at that time gender identity disorder at the age of 16. Shortly thereafter, I started college, and yes, the dysphoria was still there, but other things took hold of my attention. The workload for college, actually getting a job, other activities other than focusing on my gender. Eventually, after I graduated from college, because the response I got from coming out as having dysphoria was basically, well, you're probably just a gay man. And so eventually I decided, well, maybe I am. Now, in a incredible stroke of luck, on my very first date, I fell in love with the man who would become my husband. And that relationship helped the dysphoria go away. Now, obviously, it didn't go away completely, but it did make it manageable for a long amount of time. Now, in the intervening time between when I was growing up in the 80s and 90s and when I finally decided to transition, I had come under the mistaken impression that children had a better concept of what being gay, bi, and lesbian was. That it was more accepted, that they had more images of people potentially like them. Images I didn't have growing up. Gay-straight alliances were becoming common in schools. You know, being out as a gay person or as a lesbian was becoming very, very common. When I met my husband, I was always out as being a gay man. My husband, who had been a gay man for much longer, actually, as it turned out, wasn't out until well into our relationship, because he was used to an environment where it wasn't quite as safe for him to be out. So I thought that, hey, things are better. Young people are seeing that it's okay. They're seeing examples of gay and lesbian people that are of all types, not just a specific type. You don't have to be this type of person to be a lesbian. You don't have to be this type of person to be a gay man. I didn't realize that somehow that was not really translating down to children. So, fast forward a few years, and I start hearing about people that have detransitioned. And I start hearing that quite a few of the people that detransition ultimately decided that they just happened to be gay or lesbian, but that they had been struggling with that. And so when you have people like Buck who talk about the differences in dysphoria and why it is important that you explore through therapy the reasons you have dysphoria, this is partially why. Because if you have dysphoria because you are somehow uncomfortable or unsure about your sexuality, it is better to get that worked out in therapy than to transition. Now, why did so much of the flack go to AGP? I don't think it's necessarily because of people that have autogynephilia. I think it comes from the fact that the narrative now is autogynephilia does not exist. This is despite the fact that there are quite a few trans women that are very open about being autogynephiles. This is despite the fact that, even one of the most popular things of trans fiction recently, Detransition Baby, written by a trans woman, talks heavily about autogynephilic desires. So autogynephilia doesn't exist except for when trans people that we like says it does, or the people that say they're autogynephilia files just are completely mistaken. They can't possibly have it because it doesn't exist. Well, if it doesn't exist, they still have a form of dysphoria, and they still need to understand how that functions. The main thrust of the issue with the trans community, as I see it at this point, is you have had a big shift in the makeup of the trans community. Decades ago, the majority of people that were identifying as transgender were same-sex attracted males. In recent years, the trans women that are attracted to women have overtaken the demographic of trans women attracted to men. The other shift is that young teenagers and young females in their 20s are identifying as trans in numbers far exceeding anything that has ever been seen before. Now, I am not going to put a specific label on any of the forms of dysphoria that those types of people may be experiencing. But I will talk about the characteristics. If the majority of trans women now are coming from a demographic of older, heterosexual males, those are people with much different life experiences. I said I would make the comment a few times on Twitter that one of the reasons that I think there's so much anger coming from a lot of trans women is that when you take a demographic, white, straight men, and suddenly tell them, no, you now have people that, for lack of a better word, are used to having all the privilege, being told, well, no, you can't do exactly what you want to do because you want to do it. Whereas people from other demographics are kind of used to not necessarily getting everything they want because they're not at the top of the food chain. So you take trans men who have a lived experience of being female. You take, say, the favorite demographic that likes to be used for statistics, trans women of color. Well, you do have a race issue in there. And if you take homosexual trans women, meaning trans women that are attracted to other males, there's a societal implication that goes along with that. So there's at least some ability to adjust to suddenly not being the center of the universe. So I think in part, you're getting a lot of people that are not used to hearing no, getting upset because they're finally being told no. And I think the issue that myself and others have is this particular demographic has no problem using people from those other groups to get what they want. I was just told very recently, well, trans men exist in response to talking about, single-sex spaces. Yeah, trans men exist. But most trans men like Buck and others, usually older, understand how the reality of them being female impacts situations they may find themselves in. Whereas I find many younger trans men or younger females that are identifying as some form of trans all too willing to jump on the trans women are women, trans men are men bandwagon. They will very eagerly tell me, well, I'm a man, so of course if I go to prison, I should go to a men's prison. And I pray that they never find themselves in that situation. Because if they honestly think that that is the best place for them to be in that situation, I am very scared for them. And I think that's where at least some of the discussion of demographics comes in. See, whether some people want to admit it or not, there are sex and age dynamics at play within the trans community. Trans women have the microphone because trans women are supposedly the most marginalized creatures on the face of the planet now. We are doubly marginalized because we are trans and we are women. Trans men are frequently told to be quiet in trans spaces because they are not as disadvantaged, because they are now men, and men are more privileged than women. You also have to take into account the socialization that people receive throughout their lifetimes. And again, whether you agree or not, to some extent, it usually is somewhat true that in social situations, males are socialized to be vocal and aggressive and outspoken. Females are socialized to not be outspoken, to be consensus takers, to be able to bring people together. And that does have an impact on how people react in these type of situations. You also have to understand that there's an age factor. If the largest demographics are teen and 20-something females and 40 to 60-year-old males, who has the more power? Who has the more resources? Who is driving the narrative? We have trans women in government. We have trans women in trans healthcare. We have some trans men in trans healthcare as well, but a good chunk of your known trans advocates, your trans policy leaders, are older trans women. They have the resources, and they're pushing the narrative that benefits them. Now, let's talk about some of the ideas of, is one of the issues with autogynephilia the idea that breaking the illusion that you are a woman part of the problem? Now, I'm not going to say that that's necessarily just with autogynephilia. I think that it is part of the problem with the trans narrative, because if you have fully embraced the idea that trans women are women, then anything that is showing you contrary to that is going to be problematic to you. I do have to question, and this is even something that, yes, I will admit, my personal beliefs on changed. But, when you tell me that, third spaces, single occupancy, gender neutral spaces are not an acceptable alternative, I have to question your motives on that. Because you can tell me all day, every day, that using such space will out me as a trans person. And you're full of it. Because every place I have ever been that has had single occupancy restrooms, in addition to the full men's and women's bathrooms, the single occupancies are fairly popular because a lot of people prefer privacy when they are in the bathroom, whether they are trans or not. So if somebody is paying that much attention, that's their issue. So I do have to question, what is the real reason that you are against third spaces? What is the real reason you are against solutions other than being allowed in a space for the opposite sex? Because if it was truly about you feeling safe or comfortable, you should be able to feel safe and comfortable in those other spaces. And to be honest, most places now, it's not that big a deal to be known as transgender. It really isn't. Now, I'm not going to say that that's the case everywhere. In fact, but in a lot of places, that are pushing these policies, it's not that big a deal, despite what the activists will tell you. So, again, I don't see a diatribe against AGP. I see a concern about the trans narrative that appears to be primarily driven by people of a certain demographic, namely older trans women who happen to be attracted to women. And so if that's the case, I do question it. I do question why so much of the narrative is being driven by this demographic. Even though, we will be told, oh, it's really trans men that want some of this stuff. Trans women don't want the word, woman on tampon boxes. And a lot of the policies that we are getting, honestly, are done, supposedly, in benefit of trans men. The lessening of requirements for legal gender marker changes tended to come about in most places because the requirement of phallo or mastoplasty was so much more inhibitive for trans men than vaginoplasty is for trans women. Asking a trans man to be sterile is asking a lot more than asking a trans woman, in my opinion. To me, there really isn't a comparison between losing the ability to bear a child or losing the ability to impregnate. So again, what is the narrative? Where are these pushes coming from? We should be able to look at that. We should be able to question that. We should be able to question, why are we saying that therapy to explore dysphoria is conversion therapy? The goal of transition is to lessen dysphoria. Unfortunately, it is about the most invasive, all-encompassing way you can go about doing it. So if the goal is to lessen dysphoria, one would hope that they might be able to find easier, less invasive ways to do so. And maybe that is coming to terms with your sexuality. Maybe that is coming to terms with the idea of, that it's okay to be a male that enjoys things that are typical of females. That maybe it's okay to not be a jock and still be a man. Who knows what is necessarily causing your individual dysphoria? And maybe transition is going to be the way to cure it. But you should be able to explore it and understand it. And it should be explored with a professional, and not by going on Reddit and Instagram and Twitter and asking a bunch of people that are already caught up in their own gender whether or not you might have dysphoria, or does this mean you're a trans woman, or maybe this means I am gender fluid, or no. Therapy to explore this is good. And therapy that may ultimately lead you to say, no, I don't need to transition, I am not trans, is also good. But, as always, that's just my opinion. So, until next time, this is Cat Lady 762, and I will see you later.